I have a fantastic panel with me, and I'd love to introduce them. Liberty Matthyse is the Executive Director of Gender Dynamix, an anchor trans-led and trans-specific human rights organization that leads trans movements within Southern Africa. Liberty is a trans, non-binary woman, she, they pronouns. Liberty holds a master's degree in law, cum laude, and is focused on non-discrimination and marriage equality for trans persons in South Africa. Liberty holds numerous other qualifications pertaining to leadership, financial management, and business. As we all know, they are deeply committed to a community-centered way of care, practice, attaining social justice and human rights. I'm really excited to have Liberty with me in the space. And then I'd love to introduce our next panelist, Njeri Gateru. She, her, they, them pronouns, is a queer feminist, human rights lawyer with almost a decade of work experience working on the protection of minorities within Kenya. These issues include asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, and LGBTI communities. She's also the founding member and the executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission in Kenya, an organization that provides legal aid and engages in strategic litigation towards equal rights and the protections of LGBTI persons within Kenya. So the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission has successfully litigated, as you know, for the registration of LGBTI organizations, as well as ending forced anal examinations, and is currently on the continuous fight and litigating towards decriminalizing homosexuality within Kenya. Njeri also curates the Because Women Forum. It's a radical space for conversation and collective design on leadership, security, and wellness for LBQ identifying women in Kenya. Njeri has a law degree and is pursuing a second degree in gender and development studies. She's also a pioneer fellow under President Obama's Mandela Washington Fellowship, and having undergone leadership training in the University of Virginia and the College of William and Mary in the USA. And then our final panelist, I'm really excited to introduce Bradley R. Daniels, a clinical psychologist in private practice in Sandton. He works with individuals, couples, families, and groups across a range of clinical psychiatric adjustment disorders and employee wellness consulting. He has a special interest in working with sex, sexuality, and sexual health. He holds a master's degree in counseling for mental health and wellness from NYU. And while in New York City, Bradley completed his practicum training at the Institute for Human Identity, which is known as the first therapy institute which started addressing the specific mental health needs of the LGBTI community and its allies since the 1970s. Bradley is also an active media advocate around issues on psychosocial issues, mental health, sex and sexuality, as well as sexual identity in the media. He is the presenter on the blockbuster hit series, Sex in Afrikaans on Showmax. He is chair of the WAS International Advisory Committee on Media and Communications and the SASHA, the Southern African Sexual Health Association Executive Committee. So I am surrounded by amazing people, and I'm so happy to be in conversation with you. I guess it's interesting that we are really starting off this conversation at the end of the year. And I'm wondering, looking at, 2022 and just looking back at the couple of years that in terms of how we've arrived at this place where we are now. Njeri, Liberty, where are you at? How are you feeling? Just in terms of key milestone moments that also feel like they've been big, and how are you landing this closing of this year? Just how are you feeling within that kind of space? Who would like to kick off? Njeri.
Perhaps I will. I think Njeri,
Okay,
you want to go? Okay,
no,
go.
please go.
So thank you for having me. Thank you for having us on this platform, Jabu. It's wonderful to connect, and hello to everybody that is tuning in for this critical conversation that we are having. I think that if I had to describe where I am at this moment in time, it is basically the last stretch of a marathon that we are entering into, and the energy levels are quite low. And I don't think that we could have anticipated, or I could have anticipated, what was to come stepping into 2022 after the major lockdowns around COVID-19, remote ways of working basically came to an end. It was really trying to adjust to in inverted commas, new normal again, after having worked through 2 years of the unknown. And I think trying to adjust to the unknown and being met again with an unknown, and almost feeling like we are playing catch up, because a lot of the work that stood still for the past 2 years, as different spaces opened up, again, we needed to look at how do we accelerate our work to make the required impact. And so I think very much looking forward to the end of the year to be able to take a much needed break in being able to come back in the new year. But just looking at some of the major achievements, I think that has kept me going is the fact that we've been able to bring together a program called React, which is really trying to systematically document human rights violations within our community. And we've been able to gather evidence for advocacy to hold the state accountable for the ways in which it is underservicing the community and actively being hostile against the community. And of course, also promoting human rights advancements through advocacy, particularly on legal gender recognition and gender affirming healthcare. And so I think this has been a year of trying to restart, accelerate, and of course now trying to wind down in a way that can promote some level of self-care, but also collective care at an organizational and hopefully at a movement level, so that we are able to recover and come back in the new year with a renewed sense of purpose in championing our issues and our rights.
I should have gone fast because I don't know how to follow you, Liberty. But how are we feeling? How am I feeling? I said earlier to Jabu that I'm feeling silly today, so don't expect anything serious from me. That's how I'm feeling. But generally, looking back through what this year has been, I think it's a very unique, like 3-4 week period where we're doing reports. We're sending out proposals for the beginning of the year. We're closing accounts and going into audit season. So everyone is basically the team. Everyone is really doing something, right? So I think I'm sitting in the middle of that, in the middle of a space where we're taking calls every 2-3 minutes about something or the other, trying to finish programming that we're committed to doing. So it's a really, really busy time. And the energy, unfortunately, is also it's dwindling quite a bit. But it's really nice to look forward to the holidays, just because we were lucky enough to get some time off during the holidays. We get at least 2 weeks during the December holidays, and maybe a week and a half before we open for January. So that's really nice. So I'm really, really excited for that. In terms of the community, I think there's that general feeling of exhaustion for what this year has been, but then I think there's it's very interesting that there's a collective feeling of anxiety going into the holidays, right? Like going to the time where we're supposed to be going back home to our families, to not being in the city by yourself and surrounded by your chosen family, and having to go back to spaces sometimes that we're forced to run away from. So it's just it's a delicate space, I think, which is quite fitting that we're having this conversation now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How's it feeling for you, Bradley?
I was just taking a moment to really listen to the other panelists and to listen really quite closely. And so I want to just start with just checking in, and I'm inviting everyone, the panelists and also the audience in the back, welcome everybody, to just connect with yourself in terms of, where you are. And literally it's quite simple, just to bring your attention to your breathing, just your breath. You don't have to change a single thing, just breathe. So if you'll allow me, just less than a minute, just want you to feel what that feels like. Just bring your attention to your breathing. And that is a demonstration of a tool that we can use immediately to ground ourselves. So if I really check in with myself right now in terms of how I am, I like to check in with myself in the following way, which is, how am I in heart, body, and mind? So in mind, I feel very clear and very focused. In heart, I'm filled with excitement. And in body, I'm at ease. And so maybe you want to check for yourself where you are in terms of heart, body, and mind. And with that practice, it's the practice of mindfulness, which is the practice of staying in the here and now without judgment. So there, I've sort of answered how I'm feeling, but also I've shared a tool, which is that easy to use. Mindfulness is accessible to all populations. Unlike, for example, sometimes psychotherapy is accessible to more affluent people, but also psychotherapy can also only work in its true sense with somebody who has the right intellectual profile to be able to think symbolically. Whereas mindfulness doesn't have a requirement for a maturity level or for an intellectual level or even for a resource level like finances. Yeah. So it's been really interesting to listen to both Liberty and Njeri. And what strikes me is that the year doesn't really end, right? I mean, our bodies don't sort of say, oh, okay, it's December now. It's like, it's almost time to end. And then, the fact that you're other in sexuality or that you identify as trans takes a break until January when you are fresh. And then you can fight again and you can be that activist. It doesn't work that way. This exhaustion will travel through with you. And I think Liberty mentioned something very important, that if I look at my practice, what normally happens in the practice, I can tell you a pattern. In the 10 years of being in private practice, I can tell you a very clear pattern of what happens. So January, a lot of new people will start, like the gyms. Some won't last very long. February, it will start to pick up. Everyone is like, oh, I need to do something about this and that and that and that. And then by March, certainly in South Africa, I don't know what it is like for people from other regions in the world, but certainly by March, there's a decline because, then we have all those holidays and you have time off from work, you plan your 2 or 3 days where you can be off and then you have a whole 3 weeks or whatever off, right? And then it declines and then comes winter. And so this happens globally in the North and the South. Comes winter, everyone has a crisis because what's happening? It's cold outside, it's dark, we're indoors, it's the weather, the environment also stresses us. So that already makes us more stressed than usual. That will carry through until spring. Spring, we get a spring in our step, like everyone does, North and South. When spring comes, we all feel lighter, we take our coats off, we paint our nails brighter, we wear brighter clothes, and we feel better temporarily. Because come October in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the equivalent of about April, May, we're exhausted. The exhaustion starts to show. The burnt out feeling. October, November, in the Northern Hemisphere, April, May, difficult times for people, right? Then we get some reprieve with the Christmas holidays, North and South. Now, The challenge that's important to hear today is that the last 2.5 years, almost 3 now, have been extraordinary times. So the exhaustion people are feeling right now is tenfold more than what it normally is at this time of the year. So check in with yourself and see if that is your case. And if that is your case, I'm going to tell you that you're not alone, because actually we are now, as Liberty was saying, as things are starting to open up and there's some reprieve and there's movement, you can travel, you can go for coffee, you can do all those things. But also what's happened is in the 2 years, our social muscle, as I call it, didn't get exercise, the same as like we haven't been to the gym. And suddenly now we're jumping back into wanting to be in the club and all of that. And I don't know, certainly I can speak for myself. Suddenly you just feel like, oh, I don't want to be here so long. Like I actually, besides COVID, it's not even, yes, COVID is a consideration, but it's not because of COVID. It's just like, oh, I've had my fault. Like I don't want to be here much longer, right? So those are the things to sort of, to carry with you. And then something struck me, it just came up for me, and I'll mention it now. I don't know if it's relevant for the rest of our conversation, but during COVID, what also happened, and I think Liberty sort of touched on it, which is that things went back to basics. So in other words, your human rights things is a luxury. During COVID particularly, it was a luxury, advocacy was a luxury, because all those things have slowed down. And also the way the economy changed, it's like people were trying to make ends meet. Who has time to pay for these perceived luxuries? Well, I was recently at the Southern African SASHA, which is called SASHA, the Southern African Sexual Health Association, which is specifically geared at training and creating competence around healthcare practitioners across all disciplines around working with sex and sexual health, also sexual justice and reproductive rights as well. And they just also say WAS stands for the World Association for Sexual Health. And this thing came up for me, which I think is very important to share today. So there was a talk that one of the panels was dealing with, specifically with it was, I can't remember what the title was, but it was dealing with the tea crisis. And no, not Tina crisis, the tea crisis. During COVID, because of supply issues, there was a shortage of testosterone. Now, if you are cisgendered, what does that really mean to anyone? But if you are transgendered, that was a big deal. The same as, Njeri, what you were saying, come December, you think, oh, relax, it's time for the family. If it's a very stressful time, people go back into the closet to return back to the homes that they come from. So obviously, if you are transgendered and you have started transitioning physically, many people then choose not to go home. So that's how I am. And I think that's my sort of touch points with movement, with the population, and with mental health.
No, that's really great. And absolutely, I think listening in, sorry, it's drilling now. Oh, great.
We can't hear it, Jabu. We can't hear it.
Okay, good. I was just saying, as we was thinking about ending this year, just from a personal reflection, I'd ended a 10-year tenure as founding executive director at Iranti this year, and having exited at a level of extreme burnout, exhaustion, fatigue, and overall, I think just kind of mental health. And Njeri mentioned anxiety, etc. And it made me think, as Njeri and Liberty was sharing, and my question is really about some of us, and I would say for me in particular, and maybe there are many on this call who could resonate with the statement I would make, but particularly for trans people, I think many of us have entered our realm of activism, and I think for other queer people, with the embodiment of both transition and activism as one thing. Being awakened to one's queerness, and being awakened to discrimination, and being awakened to injustice, and having to feel this need to action, right? And there are not many people like us in the world who feel the need to action change. And there are also people who are quite happy to just be and watch other people make the change. And so there, we as leaders, we are often surrounded by many, many spectators. And so I think for us who immerse ourselves within this space of the embodiment of struggle, and particularly for people of color, Black, queer, trans people, there are many layers to this intersectionality of our identities, poverty, addictions, violence, so many embodied traumas that we come into this realm believing that this is the space that will change the world. And within the embodiment of this is the space that will change the world, we also innately either recreate or play out that trauma that we personally experience in the way that we lead. Because I guess many of us are not, we don't necessarily come into this framework as born leaders or naturally instinctual or whatever, or skilled leaders. So this also becomes part of our shaping. So what I'm trying to get at and to try and ask, and some reflections from Liberty and Njeri around this, firstly, do you have a similar experience within this? And also seeing it within the movement, how does this play itself out in terms of triggers, in terms of, I guess, a sign of unwellness, so versus a sign of wellness? Maybe we start with the unwellness part first. And how does that, is it an unwellness? Is it a trauma? And of course, it's also difficult to not have this conversation without mentioning COVID. And COVID also kind of added that inherent pressure to be action orientated, to do. We often want to do, because by doing, we are affirming change, we are creating change, but within doing, we are also creating trauma. And I don't know if you agree with that, or how can we circumvent the exacerbation of trauma in our doing?
So I think, Jabu, thank you for that very comprehensive framing on the many challenges that we are experiencing as self, as collective, as movement, very much standing as individuals with agency and autonomy, but interconnected with a collective whole, and oftentimes questioning how does that collective whole mediate the way in which we understand our own experiences, and of course, how does our experiences frame experiences for others around us. So it talks, for me, it speaks to what it means to be triggered by others within the movement, but also what it means for others to be triggered by you as an individual, by me as Liberty as an individual, and being conscious of that. I think it's oftentimes for me very difficult to speak from a position from where I am at as a person, without it sounding as if I am reducing so many complexities to my own experiences, to my own perspective, at the expense of so many around me. But I do think that if I could look at it through the lens of trauma at an individual level, that for me, my entry into the movement was birthed by violence, or through very violent practices. I often wonder where I would have ended up as a young leader. I don't know if I can say that anymore, young leader. I've jogged around the block now for a couple of times. I often ask myself what my goals and objectives would have been if it wasn't mediated by violence that necessitated me to position my course for life, to start addressing and undoing those very violences, not just at a personal level for others and myself, but also at a systemic and structural level, so that we can truly live in a world that is free from stigma, discrimination, and violence. So I often find myself reflecting on what that world would look like But of course, one can reflect, but one will never have concrete answers. But then, of course, violence, trauma birthed me into this movement. And as you indicated, birthed so many of us into the movement where we found our purposes. And many times, and particularly the past 4 years, as I've been navigating my own leadership, from a 28-year-old stepping into a directorship with traumas, historic traumas, those current traumas with inexperience, being undercapacitated, basically, to be able to fulfill the position. I speak about it frankly because I don't feel like there's any shame to speak about the ways in which we are ill-equipped sometimes for the positions that we are placed in or appointed to. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be appointed. That political representation, voice, and visibility is absolutely critical to maintain movements, to be able to maintain lines, to hold progress. But I look at how all of that culminated in the person that I was, that I am, and that I perhaps aspire to be. A person that was very, and could probably still very vigilant around how I am perceived, how I engage, how I interact. And that vigilance is not a product of that comes out of nowhere. It is a product of my history as a trans person. How do you trust those around you if your relationships with so many others before you have been rooted in distrust, both at a familiar level with your family chosen or biological, your friendship circles, who have all showcased the conditionality of the relationship in relation to your gender identity and sexual orientation. And so those past traumas mediate the ways in which we can comfortably situate ourselves within the context of leadership. And of course, what compounds that, and this is just my view, what compounds that is that many of us perpetuate that onto each other, those insecurities, those vigilances, and it's perpetuated back onto us as individuals. And then, of course, it reinforces trauma. It reinforces ways of being distrustful with one another in this space. And it's only if we can develop at a collective level a trauma-informed response for organizations, for collectives, for movements, where we are recognizing what our traumas have been. We are honest about what those traumas are. And I think that is a trauma-informed response is very much rooted in one's ability to be able to take personal accountability. And of course, at the same time, looking towards collective accountability. And if you are situated within an organizational environment, organizational accountability. So now you have these 3 tiers in context of addressing trauma that needs to respond simultaneously. If we don't respond simultaneously from an organizational response vantage point, individual and collective, then of course the equation is imbalanced, because then we are exporting accountabilities that we should be taking for our own traumas, or what the traumas that the organization or the movement and collective is perpetuating. We're exporting that somewhere else other than where it's supposed to be sitting, in order to create healthy, enabling, thriving environments to be. And so I think for me, when I look at my past experiences with trauma, how it mediates my leadership, I try and position that in across those 3 tiers and ask myself, Liberty, what are you capable of contributing from an accountability vantage point? What are the limitations? What is yours to own? What is not yours to own? And how do you speak to the different stakeholders of accountability around what they could possibly own in being able to move forward? So, so from a personal vantage point, there's that need for us to reflect around taking ownership of our struggle, taking ownership of what we've been through. The world is not going to do that for us if we don't do it for ourselves, and be able to commit to a journey of healing and restorative justice and what that looks like for us. But then at organizational levels, organizations can do so much in terms of creating an enabling environment. We budget for wellness, we budget for healing, we budget for restorative justice. What does it mean when you know that somebody stepping in an organization, into an organization, comes in with being under-experienced, under-educated? And there's a study in South Africa, the Botello by Trans study, that highlights that 52% of transgender women in South Africa do not have their matric. For about 50% of transgender women are not formally employed. Between 16 and 32% of trans women are turning to survival sex work. So if we know that that is the reality within our trans movement, how are we budgeting for healing and restorative justice so that when somebody steps in, we are able to ensure that person has access to coaching, mentoring, mental wellness, whatever that might look like, that that person has access to professional development, that there are active plans being developed to support the person from where they are at to where they could be in the next 6 months and the next year. If people are entering our organizational environment without plans that is co-created for their benefit, we are failing ourselves, we are failing our community, and we cannot then have a conversation about healing and restorative justice. At a movement level, the conversation is slightly different in terms because we know different organizations in the movement have different resources, resourcing capabilities. And so we need to start looking around how do we cross-pollinate, how do we share resources, and how do we ensure that we are able to create models where we can learn from one another, draw from one another's challenges, and of course, be able to support one another in overcoming challenges. And I think therein lies a strong conversation around the extent to which we are able to engage in effective coordination and cooperation for change at an intra-movement level. I'll pause there for now.
Yes, amazing. Yeah, there's so much to reflect on in that, and thanks. And Njeri, we're just reflecting on what Liberty's saying in relation to, you know, like our responsibilities and our leadership. How does that sit with you in terms of just what you're working through, the absorption of trauma, you know, and all looking at kind of your own way of working? What is your approach been around this from a personal and leadership level?
So when I was actually trying to remember how I came into the movement, and to what level of the movement really, right? And I remember having a conversation really early on with one of the people who was deemed to be a movement leader then, about how her saying to me that movements are born out of trauma, which is something that I think I still carry, and I've carried for a long time. And I remember saying it to someone else, and us having a laugh about, we're all doing a work of, like, we basically collectively trauma bond, right? And how do we expect it not to be harmful to ourselves, right? And so it is a thing that I've had to process as I participate in the movement, because I think that the really tricky thing is that in the ways that we show up in leadership, the lines become really blurred. How we're showing up as ourselves and how we're showing up as a person who's in charge or who's responsible for a thing or an entity or whatever, or of a certain, you know, faction of the movement in a certain geographical region, you know? So how I talk, how I love, how I drink gin in the evening, like all of that, it seems to be seen or to be interpreted as participating in a movement, right? So there's particular, I guess, scrutiny that has to undergo, right? And so that for me starts to create a challenge in how I participate, and how I treat myself, and how I treat my leadership, and how I treat the communities that I belong to, and how, and basically like runs off and continues to contribute into the thing that we are also hurt by, right? And so how do I organize around that? I think in the last 2-3 years, I've learned to value my happiness, right? Like to value my joy as a person who's participating in all of these things. And I've learned to make that necessary. I think I come into leadership from a point that says, from spaces where I'm taught, as a leader, forget about yourself, prioritize the other people, prioritize the community. And basically that's what I'd done for a really long time, right? To the detriment of myself and to the detriment of my community, because then if I wasn't at a good place, so if I wasn't at a point where I was kind to myself, then it was really hard for me to be kind or to channel kindness into the work that I was doing, right? And even though by itself the work ticked the boxes of what kind work or good work looked like, it truly wasn't, because inherently that's not the point, the place that I was organizing from. It wasn't the point where I was leading from. So one of the things that I've learned to do, and I continue to learn, is to prioritize that, that space of well-being for myself as a person, outside of Njeri the leader, or Njeri of whoever or whatever other attachment. The second thing for me is again, it's the end of the year, so we have to do our annual reports, right? And I keep saying, and I keep, like, one of the things that I struggled with in writing this kinds of reports is to say the same thing over and over again. Like, why do we exist? Like, what is the work that we're trying to do? And I've said this to my team. I was like, I feel like at the end of it, we work towards joy, right? Like, I think my work is to create a possibility of joy for queer people in Kenya, right? And outside of Kenya and in the region, but my true purpose is to create that possibility, right? And so, and in that way, not in the ways that I just report, in the ways that I activist, in the ways that we design work, I think joy is something that is really, really, really important for us to work towards, to layer in all of the work that we're doing, right? And so, as Liberty was saying about resourcing wellness, I think we really try to resource for wellness, and we really try to resource for joy. I had a really big fight in 2020 with one of the funders that was, wanting to give us a substantial amount of money, but one of the conditions for access to that money was that my team was supposed to travel in a way that would have been extremely risky for them at that point. Remember, like, we had, it was at the peak of COVID. We had, I think we were in our third wave. No one was wearing a mask. No one knew anything. And just like, and I fought so hard. Like I remember like feeling so angry and being so hurt and being so upset and having to fight for this thing. And so this funder came back to me and said, but what's special, right? Like, everyone else is doing, like, literally we're funding 10 organizations, let's say, and everyone else is taking this means of, and it was a train basically. And they were saying, be in this train for, I think 7 hours. And I was just like, how, like, what do you mean? And so, like, literally this person says to me, like, what's so special? Like, why won't you do it? And when all of the other teams, are doing it, and I say, the other teams don't have me as a leader, right? I'm not responsible for the other team. This one that I'm responsible for. This is important. we have to do this. Like, I will participate virtually, and if we don't, that's really okay. If this means that we're not going to get that money, that's really okay. Like, I'll sleep okay, And I think in those, and after that, like, I felt really bad, because that funding would have meant that we would have done something significant. And I leaned to one of the people on our board, and I said, I feel really bad about this, but I was in this huge fight, which I feel, and like, the affirmation was instant. She was just like, you should have, like, you don't have, like, say less, like, literally say less, right? And so when I was thinking about that situation, I realized that there is actually an expectation that we operate as people who are not well, right? Like, we operate because, like, because these are the conditionalities that we've been given, and we need to fit ourselves within that space, right? And the amount that takes from us really cannot be replenished by whatever it is the advantage of playing game with this would be, you know. So what possibly could have been lost in that journey and the casualties and whatever could not really be replaced by the support that we were going to get from this place, right? But I think one of the things that was really important is that it came through to even the other partners on this project that you're not going to fuck around. Yeah, pardon me, I cuss a lot. Like, you're not going to fuck around with this team because of it, just because. And I think, and in the ways that I've seen, even with my team, and even with now subsequently partners that we've gotten on, has been that ability and that intention to prioritize the well-being of the people that are actually doing the work, of the people that we're, you know, like that we're working with, of the communities that we're trying to serve, right? That this is, it's, you know, it's not going to be a thing that we think about after. Like, this is front, you know, and center of the ways that we program. So I think those are some of the ways that I think I try to work around some of the trauma in the you know, in the space. And I think the other thing is that which I was thinking about leadership earlier, is that when I was thinking about this conversation, and I thought, you know, what are the guiding, like, what are my values around leadership? And I couldn't say those for sure, like I couldn't count them immediately, but I remember that one of the things that leadership keeps teaching over and over again is the ability to listen to yourself and to introspect, right? And so that even in the decision making that we're, you know, that we consistently have to do, that there's that ability to sit with myself and be like, is this good, right? Is this a good decision? And if it is a good decision, is it a good decision for me? Is it a good decision for the team? Is it, like, you know, are we making a compromise, and where is it? And in making the compromise, what are we losing? You know, like, what voices have we not included? Which I think is a way that I think that I've learned in the work that I do within my community, and has been specifically useful for me in trying to navigate possible harm in the space.
Thank you so much. That's really great. Bradley, before I go to you, I just want to quickly, we've got a couple of comments in our chats. Anonymous attendee says, it's really great to hear the honesty and accountability from Liberty. How do we get leaders to unlearn, very important, and learn new behaviors when dealing with us as trans and intersex people that are still being discriminated against in society and in the workplace and in the movement? I think that's something just for us to think and share through, a very, very important point around, like, our own internal engagement, and how do we make the shifts in that regard. And then another comment from Patsy, which is, we need to broaden our understanding of wellness services to not only focus on the reality of trauma in our lives, but the coping mechanisms we use to either escape or deal with our traumas. We are not looking at levels of substance abuse and other drug dependencies and how that influences our quality of life, and indeed how and how long we are able to not only survive, but thrive. Very important. This counts for our siblings inside our organizations, as well as those we work with within our communities. This, as we know, is a major issue. And then a final contribution as well was, I've noticed that because we program from a place of trauma, our places of organizing tend to be messy. And unless we are intentional in centering well-being at all costs, it will only be the song we sing. Absolutely. And I think this is why we're bringing this conversation to the fore. And thank you for those comments. Bradley, thoughts? Anything that comes to?
Sure. So I've been listening quite closely to both Liberty and also Njeri, and to yourself as well, and also following some of the Q&A that's happening in the background. And I want to start with this concept of trauma, and maybe before trauma, I should actually say that if a person is other in any way, whether it be race, religion, gender, finances, economics, immigrant status, housing, homeless or housed. If you are other in any one of those categories, or many others we can think of, we know for sure as a clinical fact that the probability of negative mental health outcomes is so much higher than if you were dominant in any of those categories. And so this is where intersectionality is important. So a homeless trans person is very different to a homed trans person. A well-resourced trans person is very different to a underprivileged or under-resourced trans person, just as those examples, right? So intersectionality is important. And so now this notion of trauma, so trauma is something that can happen to anyone in many different forms. So let's go to the classical definition just of trauma, right? So trauma is any incident or occurrence, whether real or perceived, that puts that person's sort of makes that person feel like their life is at risk. Now that real or perceived is important. So if somebody is actually coming around the corner to kill me, of course it's traumatic, isn't it, right? If I perceived that that is what somebody was trying to do, it's also traumatic. Of course, perhaps I'm lucky. Maybe I discovered that, oh, it's just my neighbor in the dark. Oh, silly me. But that was also trauma. Right? Now, the other mistake or the thing I want to correct, which happens so often in the media, and so the intersectionality of the media is important here, right? Because in the media, they always talk about PTSD, right? Every news interview, they say, oh, this children PTSD. Correction. PTSD is a very specific type of diagnostic challenge. I was thinking of seeing if my arm would reach to grab the DSM-5, but it won't. So the DSM-5 is the diagnostic and statistical manual for all mental disorders, right? So it's the same, we used around the world. We're on version 5 at the moment. In fact, 5 text revised. Now, in order to give somebody that diagnosis, they need to meet the criteria in the diagnostic category. So PTSD now is a very specific type of trauma reaction. And some of the things we would look for there is that there are consistent recurrences of the memory, there's nightmares, there is a loss of the ability to concentrate, there's significant, the word significant is very important in those definitions. There's a significant decline in the overall functioning of the individual, right? So not everyone that experiences trauma develops PTSD. Whereas media, that's the impression we get. If you have trauma, you can have PTSD. It's not true. Not everyone that has trauma develops PTSD. And just because you didn't develop PTSD doesn't mean your trauma was not significant. Also to have that correction. Trauma is trauma, and trauma is difficult to process. So as Liberty said, at least what I heard is that, a lot of my sort of like reason for being and a lot of sort of being here comes out of a place of trauma and violence, which is your personal experience, and it's valid. What I think is useful as well, which I saw you doing, is that to take accountability for it. We are the only ones that are, we often have this, and perhaps as activists and as leaders, as I'm thinking now, perhaps sometimes what happens is we want to save the whole world from their future trauma. And perhaps that is often not very practical. And perhaps also, as Njeri said, it comes at our own cost. Our own personal wellness cost. And so, I've been privileged in the sense of being able, of having therapeutically, or in therapy, having worked with several activists in the course of time. And if I can anecdotally give you some of the things that always comes up in the therapy room when I'm sitting across from an activist. Yes, trauma's there. Yes, burnout is there. The burnout is often, my dog's agreeing, I'm so sorry about that. The burnout is often not the first thing that gets picked up. What gets picked up is the addiction. Sometimes it will be addiction. It will show up in the form of, sometimes it can be gambling, sometimes it can be pornography, sometimes it can even be sex. Sometimes it can be food. So those are all the ways, and that's normally what people pick up. People don't sort of, and this happens quite often. You know, people get help once they are in the symptomatic or the tertiary stages of being unwell. Because what came before that, before the addiction, the symptomatic stuff, what came before that is depression, is anxiety, and is trauma. But because those don't get treated, it leads to the addiction and the other things. And so, of course, everyone goes, oh, you know, he or she's such a drinker, or they are such drinkers. Look a bit deeper. There's more going on there. And I just apologize for the sunlight. I can't really do much about it right now. It's load shedding, and suddenly the sun has come out. And so I'll do the best that I can. I wish I could send my dog to close the blinds. So I think what's really important for me from a clinical perspective, and this conversation is so important today, because in order for us to create a healthier society, we need to create healthier organizations, particularly activism organizations. In order to have healthier activism organizations, we need to have healthy employees working in those organizations.
Absolutely.
And in order to develop our leadership, we need to spend money to train our leadership, whether it is emotional intelligence, whether it is purely self-care. Which is one that you don't often hear people, or people don't want to invest in it. It must be like oh, you know, it's like let's go and let's have a lunch together this afternoon and we'll spend, you know, we'll spend 1,000 Rand and that will be our self-care. That's a good start. But self-care often is a lot more of an intricate act with self. And in my experience, to teach people that act is really difficult. And it takes money to bring people back from burnout. I always use this example in my practice. You've got a car, perhaps, you know that if you want your car to run efficiently, you've got to refuel it. Huh? If you stop putting in fuel, what will happen? Obvious, it's going to get stuck, right? And most people can answer that question. And then you say, then what do you do? And then the affluent amongst us say, oh, you know, then I call the dealership and they bring some fuel. Or I call my insurance. You know, some of us who are less privileged maybe have to then scurry around, call somebody, a cousin, an uncle, or maybe we have to walk to the garage to get a canister to put petrol in. But the long and the short is you're good to go in a short period of time. Now, why is it that people don't understand that when we don't refuel ourselves as people, we will stop running, we will stop functioning. That's what burnout is. The whole body shuts down and we stop functioning. And, you know, sadly, we don't just go to the nearest electrical, you know, like these electric cars now, you just quickly drive to
and charge yourself up.
Charge yourself and you're good to go. Also, you can't come to me and say, hey, listen, Bradley, here's my head. Please take care of it. My body's just quickly going to go down the road to go and take care of my nails and my weight and all of these other things. I'll be back. I'll pick it up in 6 weeks' time. It doesn't work like that. It's like it also takes energy to recover from burnout. So for me, do proactive things to avoid burnout. And that doesn't mean that, so what do I mean by that? Do proactive things to avoid burnout. So for example, take good care of yourself. Let's start with the basics. Sleep well. Easy rule. 7 is heaven, 8 is great, 9 is like wine. 7 hours has actually been shown to be the right dosage of sleep to be able for us to get the maximum benefits from that medication, which is sleep. So if you think about the sleep, it's called the sleep revolution, where we say that instead of giving people drugs to fix type 2 diabetes, to fix cholesterol, to fix bone density, to fix mental health illness, to fix insomnia, to fix all those things, let's correct their quality of sleep so that they have quality sleep at the right time of the day. So we also know there's a difference between sleeping 7 hours from, let's say, 11 till 6 in the morning versus sleeping 6 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. It's almost like you're taking 2 different drugs. You're not getting the same formulation if that drug is called sleep, right? Eat well. Eat in a way that really nourishes your body. And I mean that, quite aware of structural inequality. Maybe somebody's eat well is stuff from, from the, these health food places and from Dis-Chem and whatever the case may be. But that's not what I mean. Eat well within your means. Eat what is, you could, for example, make a choice. Let's take, for example, the experience, particularly in the first world. If you are poor in the first world, takeaways make better sense than foods from like Whole Foods in New York or those where it's cheaper to get a Big Mac meal, right? There's also kind of in South Africa, in the South African context, which is the one that I'm most familiar with in the South, in the global South, is apples and fruits and vegetables. They're not as expensive as elsewhere in the world. So eat well. Eat well to support your body. You've got to refuel your body in order to be well. Then the practice of mindfulness, as I have just demonstrated at the beginning of the talk, is very useful for us to ensure that we remain grounded and present with things as they are. So those are just small little tools that you can add on to ensure that you yourself, you're well. Because if you're well and you're well nourished and your self-care is good, you have capacity to take care of others. If you are not well nourished, you don't have capacity to take care of others. It's like on a plane when they say in the event of an emergency, make sure to secure your own mask before assisting anyone else. Because let's say it's a child. If you as the parent, you fumble around trying to do their mask, your mask, guess what's going to happen? Both of you are going to die because you're not going to manage to get theirs on. You're also not going to manage to get yours on. So actually now both of you are no longer going to be. So it's that brutal. The last thing I want to add on is boundaries. Boundaries are critical to our self-care. Boundaries. And I'll say that word again. Boundaries. It's critical to our self-care, particularly as activists. It's the one thing that I see as a repeat offender for contributing to the unwellness of the activist. Boundaries. And so, I think of a real example. Somebody said, yeah, but somebody said to me, challenged me, said, what do you mean boundaries? When a lesbian woman is being killed in a township on the East Rand, I'm the only person that can jump out of bed, drive there, or find myself there and know who to talk to and to advocate for the police. That may well be true. However, it tells me from an organization or from a movement or from an activist perspective, your succession planning has not been thought through. It's that simple. You see, sometimes also the challenge I find is that, particularly with the, sort of, shall we say, organizations that are movements. Corporate organizations have this sorted out. And I think organizations that are movements should be no different. You should have a succession plan. So for example, Jabu, when you step down, I certainly hope that like the person that took over from you has been in the planning maybe for the last 10 years. Does that make sense? Certainly Liberty, when you stepped into that role as a young leader, wouldn't it have been easier if there was a plan for your training and development to say, Liberty, this is where you are now. This is where we see that you're going to be in the next 10 years. So this is how we're going to get you there. Don't stress. We've got every step of the way. Makes for a more competent and a more comfortable and a more confident leader.
Well, thanks. Absolutely. And I think I want you to get to the
Jabu.
point around. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jabu, I just wanted to ask whether there would be space just to perhaps
Oh, yes.
respond and engage to some of the things that Bradley has indicated, all of which are critical. But I think that there
Yes.
might be some nuances that
Yes.
one would want to think about through the lens of the praxis of leadership, the practice of leadership, looking at how we work oftentimes in under-resourced environments from a survivalist vantage point. And so the way in which we structure interventions to support health and wellness and development for self and for others around is very much, I think many times we can have a conversation around moving from the foundation that we are existing in well-resourced organizations. And I think if we are to be honest with ourselves, Jabu, I don't want to drag Iranti into it, but GDX and Iranti are relatively well-resourced in comparison to many of our counterparts, hence why we have been able to put in place particular programs of support to be able to support the progression of our community members who are also employees, be able to put in place the required mental health support, coaching, mentoring, to have those more strategic types of discussions around staff retention and of course for sustainability, and how does one create a cycle, an organizational culture that is conducive, which of course, again, the foundation is being well-resourced, but in organizations, in movement, broader trans-organizing for us, where we know that there isn't sufficient resources to even pay people what they are worth and what they are contributing to the work, let alone invest in HR support programming to be able to support their wellness and progression. I think that that makes it very difficult to achieve the level of outcomes around health and wellness that we are talking about. And so when we have that conversation around what the ideal would be, if we had to cost our HR plans at the moment, and what support is available for our community members, our teams, then I think many of us would be in trouble because we don't have the resources to support that. And so I do think that we need to be able to ground that. Of course, this type of conversation also ties into the capitalistic model around burnout, the NGOization or the corporatization of the NGO sector, increased competition for resources, the perceived increased competition amongst organizations, to be able to be relevant, to be able to do the work, to be able to advance a particular agenda. And I think that therein lies the problem, and perhaps if we unpack it even further, the solutions for how we can start thinking about health and wellness outside of just the financial resourcing. But of course, that's a different conversation altogether. But I just wanted to add that caveat to it.
Yes.
And Njeri, do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's been brilliantly put
Right.
together.
Yeah, just some comments again, and I'll just give the mic to Kenneth. Kenneth, do you want to make a comment or question? Is Kenneth on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, welcome.
Really, I'm grateful for the mic. I wanted to share about something like, as in here in Uganda, we trans women, we face a lot of trauma. We seek for mental illness, like a month, end of the month, we seek for mental illness, safe spaces in the community. Some of us, we want health services for only trans women, because you cannot tell me to go to service center where there are they're called MSM persons, and me trans, they will look at me as I'm not a person, or as I'm not a human being. They will see me as a a human person, doomed person, as you know. So we need that and empowerment in our community. We face a lot of problems. We face a lot of trauma. We like in our communities. We do face like being safe. You know,
Mhm.
you get me. Being safe. We need that to be added in our sorry, facing a lot of problems as in our
Thanks.
communities. We face a lot of people who are seeing us as we are not a people, we are not persons.
Yeah.
They see us, we are not like, how can I say it? But we
Mm.
need we
Thanks, Kenneth. Sorry, we did get the gist of your concerns and what's coming up for you. Also just to um, acknowledge some of the other comments, and Super is also saying we really need to be honest about the challenges around trauma and burnout that comes with doing this work and our mental wellness. We often send other people for help, but we ourselves don't get help. Um, Ramya saying that there are very important conversations to be had across activism spaces. Many times activists feel caught up with the action and do not realize the importance of taking care of ourselves. And there's so much of guilt and altruistic notions of our work, and self-care is seen as an act of selfishness. Absolutely true. That does resonate with me. And there is such an important conversation. This is from Bhutto. This is such an important conversation. And the speakers have really highlighted the important aspects about the who we are as activists and the way in which we have forced ourselves to reboot and continue and not reflect on the harm the work itself has affected in the way we process, the way we heal our physical bodies, mentally and emotionally, and how we even view well-being. We have sort of shelved it as a foreign concept, forgetting how our own communities and grandparents have practiced well-being and care communally. The food they ate, the time spent in nature, in how their farm village lives were set up, the checking in with each other over the fence. We can easily revisit how these inexpensive and caring practices enhanced well-being and connectedness. This is, of course, with the acknowledgement of the various challenges we face currently. And let us drink water, please. Wonderful. A safe place internationally. And then Mona Lisa also saying this conversation has enabled me to reflect about the vital importance of letting go of situations that you can't change, and say to thyself that I am already living in an imperfect world and can't correct anything and everything around me. Thank you for all the comments. I think there's another one. Bradley has raised very big and important issues. And one that is very touching is about festive and how others go back home to be in the closet. Some can't even go home because they're in the middle of transitioning. I say we need to be very kind to people because we do not know what they are going through, and also a plea to those whom are out of the closet at their homes to respect other individuals who are in the closet when they go home. Let's show acts of kindness and togetherness. I know that we are running out of time, but I think that's a good point also to kind of center ourselves, is to ask in this period that we are entering now, there's definitely a lot of elements of loneliness, trans loneliness, queer loneliness, people who are not in relationships, people who are not in relation with their families, and so on. So I think there's that part of it. And then the other part that I'm also wanting to ask about activism and our activist lives is whether we've become so married to our work, because that is the way that we connect and we stay connected to each other. So even within the space of trauma and high levels of activism, this work almost is a way of us avoiding the loneliness that we experience outside of our personal well-being. And so do you agree with my statement? Is this your single marriage? Or do you have other marriages? And I guess how do we center that kind of way of loneliness and thinking about that and acknowledging it, naming it and acknowledging it. Bradley?
If I could just grab the space quickly, because I'm aware of, I have a hard boundary for 6 p.m.
No
so problem. I want to be sure that I give as much as I can before we finish. So I'm going to try to tie many things together, and I'll do so very slowly. So number one, I'll go back to a very crucial lesson that a very old professor, retired in her 80s, shared with us on the last day of her teaching us for a full year. And she actually just taught us clinical interventions. And she said, I just want you, if you don't remember anything for this year, I want you to remember the following. And she said, this here is a job. Treat it like a job. Don't romanticize it as it's a calling, it is my life, it is this, it is that, because then you set yourself up for disaster. Rather ensure that you have balance in your life, focus on your relationships, focus on your wellness, focus on your children, if that's what you're going to do, focus on your development, the balance. And I can profess and I can affirm that if somebody asks me, what are the challenges of being a psychologist in private practice? I'm going to say this one thing. I'm going to say the challenges are wellness, self-care and wellness, and being able to balance. Remember, we're balancing money versus work versus patients versus your own personal life. It's many different things. And for me, the success is, and I think the same would apply to an activist, because activists and psychologists do very similar things in many ways. We want to integrate a better world. We can only create a better world if we are well resourced within ourselves. That's number one. Number two, yes, I accept that we live in a world that has structural inequality because of the dominant ideology, which is capitalism. And that is unfortunately the world in which we have to navigate. And that means that some organizations are more resourced than others, right? So some have money from big funders, Hivas, Tecano, those people who have lots of bucks to throw around, right? So all you have to do is you just have to have a good proposal and then you'll get the money, right? However, I don't want us to be fatalistic about when we don't have resources, our hands are tied. Because like I showed in the beginning, mindfulness doesn't cost a penny. It's your own breath. You can read on the internet, if you have access, and let's say, I could hear some activists going, yeah, but the world, the haves and the have-nots. But listen, even in the have-nots, almost every person has a smartphone of some sorts that can go on the internet and check something. And so there's lots of resources on mindfulness. And then I also want to share, in places where there aren't resources. So for example, the caller we had from Uganda, where the resource is not available. There's not somebody that says, this is the shop that you come to if you are transgendered and we will support you. At least there's a shop for MSM, right? However, what I've seen in other organizations that are working in the most, in the most under-resourced environments globally, is they do something very clever. They look at creating champions in the community. So some example, there's that auntie that likes to listen to people's stories. She's very good and all of these things. That becomes for example, can become your peer counselor champion. And that person will then teach other people themselves. And so what you would then need is, let's say, for example, and I've done this before, you need, for example, a psychologist to come in and do training with a couple of peer counselors, give them the basic skills that they would need, blah, 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 from time to time, have touch points, but at least then you're not over and over paying for the rates of a psychologist. You have some people that have basic knowledge, and actually they are then able to identify, to say, oh, okay, I've been listening to Jackie. Ooh, Jackie makes me worry. Jackie needs to see Bradley. Instead of having 100 people see Bradley, Jackie, who's been the one identified as being most at risk, Jackie comes, because the other 99 are well kept in the system of peer counseling. So a lot of HIV organizations use that very same model and so forth. So that's the other option. Again, also, the realities of the capitalist system is that one has to invest to get a return on investment. So you have to pay to get a professional to come and teach you something professional. So let's say if you are paying an HR practitioner to teach you how to do a succession plan, you pay once off, you learn the skill, and then you carry that skill through in the organizational memory. And this is where succession planning is important. Like Liberty can't, or Njeri can't just decide tomorrow I'm going, and then everything lies with Liberty and Njeri, and it's the end of that. So we have yet another poorly functioning movement exercise. The last thing I want to say is, because it came through in some of the chats, mindfulness, because I really want to just give tools. Mindfulness, great tool. Forest bathing, and we live in such a beautiful country in South Africa, and I'm sure many other places are just as beautiful. You know, the act of just going into some sort of nature. Even the act of just walking on barefoot on grass, I read a study that says that it actually helps to change the ions in the body, and this is what creates the feeling of wellness, right? Boundaries. If it's all you remember is boundaries today, you've got to set a boundary which says, and the boundary which says basically, I will practice wise compassion versus foolish compassion. So quick definition: foolish compassion is giving wholeheartedly to another and neglecting yourself. Wise compassion is giving wholeheartedly to another without neglecting yourself. So for example, my friend asked me for 1,000 Rand. Foolish compassion is, okay, friend, there it is, take it. Wise compassion is like, oh, okay, friend, let me just look at my situation. Okay, I need 500 Rand to pay for, it's Christmas now, I forgot I need to give my so-and-so a bonus. Oh, friend, I really want to help you, but I can only give you 500. There's the boundary clear. If we're operating in foolish compassion, we often feel resentful. Like, you're doing something good. I gave my friend 1,000 Rand. Why is it I'm left with this terrible feeling of feeling guilty, feeling bad, hating them when my landlord says, hey, like, you short 1,000 Rand with rent. You're like, oh, I shouldn't have given that money to Liberty. Damn it. Right? So that's the other thing. And then safe spaces. We have to focus on creating safe spaces for ourselves. You cannot, when I worked in the prison service, after 3 months of being there, I didn't know this until somebody pointed it out to me, because I'm from the township, man. I'm not scared of any inmate, like I can roll with the punches. And one of my colleagues heard that, like, I'd been working without a guard at my window. She's like, are you crazy? I was like, but they okay, and And what I learned there is you cannot do effective work if you are feeling unsafe.
Yep.
So you have to secure your own safety before you can make others safe. Then the letting go, that's a touchy one, but we may have to touch on it another time, because if it was so easy as just letting go, let go of your trauma, Liberty, let go of your trauma, Njeri, let go of your trauma, Bradley, let go of it. Just let it go. You are grown up now. If it was that simple, we would have done it already. It's not that simple. So what I often say to people is, let it be. Put it down for a moment until you have more capacity to pick it up and look at it again. And you look at it for maybe a few minutes, maybe an hour in therapy. When you're done, you put it down, you come back to it again. So that's letting things be versus letting things go. Because letting go creates more unwellness than letting be. Right? And I think that's, this one is important. I cannot skip this one. Grief.
Yes,
grief is an important part of what we need to understand and work with at this time. We're grieving the loss of loved ones over the last 2 years due to COVID. We're grieving the loss of a life we once knew. And then there's many other forms. People are grieving the loss of a job, loss of a home, the loss of, if I'm just thinking, the people who couldn't access testosterone, they lost progress in their transitioning. If people are transitioning as well, and this will be my end note, because it's a nice thing to kind of leave people thinking. When we transition, yes, we transition into the body that we always should have been anyway. And it seems like it's all bells and whistles, and that's great. Nobody talks about the fact that there is grief for your old body, even though it's not the one that you wanted, it's not the one that you connected to, but there's grief. And that grief, if it is not articulated consciously, it shows up in ways which becomes destructive to the optimal wellness of a trans person. And that is my final tune.
So much. Thank you. Absolutely. I think we just before you go, there's a quick question regarding your service, if you don't mind, just whether you do any organizational group work. Group organizations face a lot of pressure. Do you work with any facilitated services in that way?
Sure. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, my website is very simple. It's just bradleyrdaniels.com. You will find my details there. You'll find the work that I've done. But yes, the answer is yes, I do groups, I do facilitated work, I do employee wellness consulting, which I've done with the United Nations, I've done with the Office of the President, with many corporates and so forth. So and also I want to also to say to people, also feel free to kind of send an email if you need. I can direct you. I may not be able to be the person for you, but I can direct you in the right direction. And also want to say, while this talk was happening, I did encourage for executives of the Southern African Sexual Health Association to tune in if they could. Maybe you could make the recording available to them, because I think these conversations are important for them as well. And also with the World Association for Sexual Health, of which there is WPATH, which is part of that as well. And, these conversations are being tackled all the time. And in my experience as, part of WAS, it's important for us to hear these voices on the ground. And often, for me, we hear a lot of Northern voices. We don't hear Southern voices.
Absolutely.
And are important, and hence I invited them to tune in and listen to these conversations as well.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. I know you have to step off. I just want to check with Liberty and Njeri. Are you okay to stay 10 more minutes?
Okay.
Great.
I'm good.
Okay. Thanks, Bradley.
So I'm going to say thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you today. And please, I really, I extend myself to whatever support you may need. It's sometimes just an email away. Sometimes it's a simple question to say, listen, am I doing okay here? It's really that simple. So please, I'm open to that. My website is the place to get.
Oh, thank you. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Cheers. Take good care of yourself. Bye.
Bye. So, Liberty and Njeri, we just have a few more questions. There's one question regarding support for trans persons in prisons. Also, just thinking about the trauma. This is from Princess Rihanna from Uganda, who works with trans persons in prisons. Maybe something to think of, like just if there's information to share, or there's also a question about how Iranti, is there a link to this continued work with Iranti? So perhaps Nolwazi could just also just type in to that, or would wish to respond to that. And then just people asking for a wellness movement building panel 2 with us. So I think just to indicate if you're willing to do another panel, perhaps early next year, we could do another one. And then psychosocial support is paramount, definitely for grassroots level and support. Any closing comments and thoughts? I want to just ask one. I loved what you said, Njeri, which was about resource for wellness, resource for joy. I think it was Brene Brown that said that the hardest thing that humans struggle with is joy. We are immensely immersed into issues of shame, into issues of our pain, and kind of staying within that realm. And often we struggle to move out of that realm into spaces of joy. And I'm wondering if whether we could reimagine a different way of being or a different way of organizing in our movements. Could that evolve from this kind of conversations, from these spaces, showing up differently and so forth? And just some of your own thoughts about, messages to the movement and to the people that fund us, to the resources, to our communities. What would that mean in terms of showing up? And not toxic positivity. I mean, like genuine joy, even if they're small steps of relaxation, self-care, perhaps slowing down and so forth. And yeah, just for us to think about that, Njeri, would you like to kick off?
Sorry. I think so. I'm trying to express this thought from where it comes from. And it's such a long train, but I came in, like, in the ways that I come into activism, I find a system that's kind of formalizing, right? Like that the Kenyan queer movement was at that point, starting to be a technical movement, a registered movement, like proper organizations that needed a head, shoulder, knees and toes, like whatever that looks like in an organogram, yeah? And kind of like, and that activism also takes a certain kind of shape, but then unfortunately, in the ways that I interacted with it, it was organizing from a point of scarcity, right? That you needed to fulfill this statutory requirements so that you could have a bargaining ability from this really small pool of resources that we had at that point, right? And so the growth of organizations, unfortunately, becomes like within that fabric becomes the thought of, if we have, then you don't get, or if we get, then we don't have, and it was that system of competing for resources. And I think I'm really glad that's really moved, and it's really morphed in the ways that I've in the time that I've participated in movement and in organizing. And one of the ways was in partnership, right? That people began to imagine partnership in different ways. And in those different ways, I think we're able to marshal resources, more resources, better resourcing. And that started to become useful, but then also it became reparative for the friction that had already existed, right, at that point. But then now, even the ways that we as an organization design programming or interventions, I think there's so much to learn from what younger generations, and I'm now very old in my gay years, but like younger in the ways that younger generations are organizing. And that when we think, and like even when we're doing like small things like sending invites for things, we have to remember that people don't only exist in organizations, right? You have to remember your activists who are working in a different place, like in the grassroots. You have to remember the free radicals who will show up like once in 3 months and do a really magical thing and then disappear back into the clouds, right? Like that those really important key voices have space in the ways that we organize, right? And I think that has been really useful for me to understand, to understand and to imagine what possibilities could look like. And I remember, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had a program that included, I think we had yoga once every 3 months, and it was literally like a thing for laughing about, and were dragged so much for being activists who made space or organized or asked for resources for yoga, right? But now, 5 years later, actually, like, people have included wellness practices in their organizing as institutions, as wellness rooms in conferences and whatever, and small things that might not be the most useful, and sometimes that might be performative, but are a thing that now exists that didn't exist before, and I do have so much appreciation for that. I think also what has also been very key is the conversations that we've had and we continue to have, and the ways that we've been able to push back from the spaces where our resourcing comes from, right? That we move away from who has been the traditional donor and who's been the traditional funder, and the systems that they have around funding, right? That we can reach out to small organizations and say, we need care packages for 12 survivors of violence, and is there a possibility, is there a way that that we can interact with this, but then also to say to big funders, listen, we need to go and swim in the river, and that's the thing that's going to heal us. So figure that out, because that's what's necessary, and to exist in a place where that's listened to and that's honored and that moves and there's leadership in that, I think has been very necessary. And because this is our last, I think this is the last thing that we're about to say. You asked Jabu earlier about the ways that our marriage into the movement, right? And I thought my lover says something that I find so important about addiction to community, right? And she says that, we're addicted to community. Like once you get into community, you get addicted to it, right? And the ways that the community self-protects sometimes is important, although that means that we leave some people out, right? And I think when you get, and in my experience, getting into that community kind of gave me, and I've seen it happen over and over again, has given people currency to engage, right? Like that my currency as Njeri stops being who I am as a person, but the Njeri that's seen within that movement, the Njeri that can offer this, the Njeri that can show up when you call her from the police station, and when that happens, I think it becomes very hard for ourselves to imagine ourselves outside of the ways that we've been imagined within that community. And I think what has been helpful for me and very useful is that being outside of my work, because my work, as Bradley so rightly put, my work is my work, it's work, right? That outside of that, I exist as a person, and I am loved, and I am held, and I am affirmed as a person who's outside of all of the things, because Njeri, who's an activist, is a very fallible Njeri, right? Like I'm, anything could happen. I could be canceled today, or I could lose my credibility today, and that person is fallible. But who I am as a person, and that I have space and hearts that hold that who I am as a person outside of that currency is really, really important, and is really it grounds me and really informs the way that I negotiate with my community. Yeah.
Jabu, you on mute?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, yeah, completely resonate with so much of your words, and thinking about that either as separation or as integration, or as both, Liberty?
So a lot of what Njeri has said also resonates with me. I have taken a political decision for my own wellness to not date within the movement. Because I am not gonna come home at night and try and rehash all of the things that has happened in the movement, trying to find solutions on the couch, or in the bedroom. And that can be very traumatizing, I think. And I think for me, one of the ways in which I have tried to shelter myself is to make a conscious decision around how I choose to go about walking the path of finding love. Because otherwise I've been very scared of finding myself in a space, in a relationship that would perpetuate the trauma, and not just the interpersonal trauma within the relationship, but also movement, organizational trauma in different ways. And so I think for me that has been very helpful. But I think at the same time, I think of wellness in separate, my personhood in relation to the work that I do, as not separate and polarized and oppositional. I think of it much more through an integrated lens around how can I find harmony and synergy between the two. Because when I step into the organization at 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning, then of course it is, I step into the space with all of who I am, my entire personhood. I'm not parking my personal experiences with family, with friends, with what happened in the home, etc. at the door, and then say, okay, now I'm done with that, I'm stepping into the organization. Nor am I stepping in by my home in the evening when I return with the notion that I must now park GDX completely. For me, it's really around finding a healthy balance between, and I think our intuition guides us in how the organization, the movement type of work tries and takes too much than what you can offer. Vis-a-vis sometimes us stepping into the organization with our personhood, trying to take too much from the organization in terms of what it can offer. And so I think it really boils down to a deep understanding, deep presence and consciousness that we need to develop and hold in order to not have an imbalance between the two. But very much for me, an integrative approach and not polarizing and oppositional, either or. I think in many instances, how we try to look at joy in the organization, we are trying to look at how do we create space for our communities, for us to not just thrive, and I like what Patsy said earlier, or not just thrive, not just survive, but actively thrive. How do we create a space for dreaming, for aspiring? And I think that we have recognized two key projects in which we can start exploring what that could look like in real ways. The one is a Tiralitsa study, which is basically around countering violence, gender-based violence against trans and gender diverse persons. But one key aspect of the space is to create a space in which we can reflect around what we want to be in life, what we want to become in life, and then start identifying ways in how we can manifest that vision, that dream for ourselves. And so that's one component. The other one is really around solidarity community spaces to try and break down the divisions, the artificial divisions that have been erected across between gender identity, sexual orientation, as if they are standalone. The gays and lesbians do not want to be associated with transgender and gender diverse persons. There are disconnects within our community. What it means to build solidarity across class lines, what it means to build solidarity across geographical location lines, being able to bridge the urban and rural divide. So all of these components, trying to see how do we bring our community members, us into a space where sports and picnicking can unite us, and at least in that space, be able to, without the pressure of the work, start engaging each other in a much more meaningful, human-centric and deeper way than what we would ordinarily be able to. And I do think that we need to invest a lot more resources and effort around in conflict resolution and being able to explore tensions, because in many regards, those mechanisms doesn't exist, and we have the propensity, because of our historic traumas, to misunderstand, misinterpret, and miscommunicate what we mean. And therein, we walk away from spaces, having reaffirmations around our dislike for one another, our unconnectedness with each other. And I think that if we are able to create a space where we can come, have authentic, clear, but respectful conversations that are rooted in my view is not superior than your view, but I recognize your experiences as real, your challenges as real, the way you view the world as real to you, but this is how I view the world, and I am ready to find common ground and a common space from which to depart from in order to advance solidarity and collective action. Because if we can't do that in our movement, we are not going to be able to toe the line for progress. The external oppositional forces, they bank on a divided movement. They bank on us not being able to reach consensus. They bank in us not having a united voice when we step into a space. But in order to have a united voice and to foster collective action, we must be able to, of course, deal with the tensions and the conflicts in healthy ways in the movement. And if we can deal with the conflicts and tensions in a healthy way, immediately it opens up more space for joy, because one cannot build joy and positivity where the foundation, the entire culture of the space that we are in is conflict-ridden and fault lines are emerging all over the show. So I think for me, that is very important. And of course, one way in being able to contribute to minimizing conflict and tensions within the movement and within our organizations is to explore power sharing models, sharing models and resource distribution and resource sharing models to be able to ensure that we recognize equity as an inherent part of the way in which we want to organize, the way in which we want to build, the way in which we want to be in this world. And that would mean that we would need to have very important conversations around what it means to move towards a movement space where we can all be strong together, where we can all build strongly together, where we can all aspire to inspire each other and to create joy together. And so for me, just from my vantage point as leader, those types of principles doesn't only manifest at the collective level, but it's also about how we engage ourselves as individuals. And Bradley spoke about how we reflect, introspect, and of course, be able to understand what are we showing up with in a space, being conscious of that, being mindful of that, and then of course, asking ourselves the question, who do we want to be in this space in order to effectively contribute in how we move forward?
Oh, thank you to both of you. And in the absence of Bradley, just to say thank you for bringing us so much enrichment and so much space of reflection and thinking through our continuous work in how we shape this world, how we shape our lives, how we build community, how we build better organizations in so many ways. I want to just leave and to thank everybody that have stayed on as well, and to say thank you for your contributions as audience, as participants, as partners to this conversation. Just two quotes that resonated with me. The one was from a British author, Elaine de Botton, who said, we should not feel embarrassed by our difficulties, only by our failure to grow anything beautiful from them. And I think from our difficulties, we become more enriched. From our difficulties, we nurture, we grow, we enrich that cycle of learning and sharing and growing. And then finally, we cannot end this conversation without a message from the Lord, Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So thank you everybody for being here, and may you have a wonderful break, a safe break. Remember what Bradley said about the breath. Even if it's small connections with nature, with yourself, with people around you. Rest well, be well, and may the struggle continue. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, Jabu. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.